I'm going to structure this breakout around three of those young people and their stories to help illustrate some of the themes that I think are particularly illuminating, both within the chapter and throughout the book. The first young person is Carl. Carl was 16 when he moved into a care home in Kent. Annie, who was managing the care home at the time, described him as an utter sweetheart, charismatic, funny and caring. And I add, by the way, that Carl's not his real name. I'm not using the real names of any of the young people. Carl had a loving relationship with his mother and siblings. However, he grew up in a house where the threat of violence from his father was ever present. Carl himself became violent, no doubt fueled by his anxiety, confusion, and anger. At 15, Carl was sent to a young offenders institution for assaulting his girlfriend, and he entered the care system when he was released. Carl's girlfriend gave birth to their first child not long after that, and Carl began a vocational mechanics course at a college, an outlet for his curiosity. However, needing money, Carl became involved in petty crime, and it wasn't long before his attendance dropped and he was kicked off his course. Annie couldn't tell me what had happened to Carl. He left her home aged 18. That is a very brief overview of Carl's story, and for me it raises several themes that run throughout the chapter. So firstly, his story highlights some of the reasons that children enter care. When a child is referred to social services, social workers must conduct an initial assessment to determine next steps. The most commonly identified need is abuse and neglect. The primary need for over half of children in need, that is any child with a child in need plan, a child protection plan, or a child who's looked after. During initial assessment, social workers also identify the cause of need, and the most common factor here is domestic violence. This is followed by concerns over mental health, and together, these factors account for more than a third of all factors identified, and are certainly relevant in Carl's story. Secondly, Carl's story reveals another really important point, which is that paradoxically, children are not in care necessarily because of a lack of love. Carl had loving relationships at home. This in turn makes a third point. Because of structural issues, including a lack of funding and resource, the children's social care system is permanently playing catch-up. Families experiencing violence and abuse often cannot access adequate early support, and for Carl, separation from his family was probably not the right option. Next, for me, Carl's story illustrates how black and white our care system is, and we've already heard reference to this this morning. Carl came from a loving home and was separated from that. And it's not for me to say whether that was the right decision or not, but manifestly, his path implies that perhaps it wasn't. Finally, his story touches on a difficult topic relating to the extent to which children's care settings are criminogenic. And actually, this is something Emmanuel has mentioned already. That is the extent to which they cause criminal behaviour. So clearly, Carl got involved in petty crime, having gone into care. So some argue that children's homes expose their inhabitants to risky behaviours that they perhaps otherwise wouldn't have been exposed to, and in turn make children more likely to engage in crime. Others argue that the children who are going into such settings have had experiences as children and come from circumstances that mean they are more susceptible to that risk. And my book, I've got ideas above my station. My chapter explores that idea and some of the tensions there. The next story that I want to tell you about is David's. David had lived in London with his mum, and he suffered from chronic and significant mental health issues. He developed anxiety about his health and drug addiction, which Annie believed to be a form of self-medication. David's mother was controlling, and her intense anxieties about his welfare exacerbated David's own worries. David's health deteriorated. He was sectioned and put into care after attempting suicide. And it was at this point that he went to live at Annie's care home. Upon arriving at the home, David demonstrated some warning signs of emotional abuse. He was withdrawn, anxious, fearful of doing the wrong thing. But it wasn't long after entering the home that actually he grew in confidence, his health and well-being improved, and he was able to re-engage with his education. This brief description of David's story, I think, again, highlights some important themes. Again, it's worth reiterating, he wasn't in care because of a lack of parental love. His mother loved him very dearly, and he suffered abuse. Secondly, David's mental health meant that he found it difficult to protect himself, and there's a wider point here, which is that children with specific health needs, including often children with forms of SEND, are particularly susceptible to abuse. Thirdly, David shows us that care can be hugely beneficial. I absolutely don't want anyone to think that I think care is not is a sort of blanket bad option. Far from it. For David, it offered a fresh start and the opportunity for him to re-engage with his education, as I've said. Fourthly, I think David's story helps illustrate how children growing up in certain families are more likely to come into contact with social services than others. And this is a hugely important theme that runs throughout the book. Growing up in a family with a single parent where money was tight makes the job of being a parent harder. David's mother had her own mental health issues, but these would no doubt have been easier to manage had she had more support available to her. My chapter highlights how poverty is a major driver of contact with children's services, and Loic's already mentioned the fact that children living in the 10% most deprived neighbourhoods are 10 times more likely to be looked after or on a child protection plan than children in the least deprived 10% neighbourhoods. And what that means is that there's almost a postcode lottery element to this. Depending on the circumstances into which you're born and where in the country you are, your chances of engaging with social services are affected. The final story is Ben. Ben entered care having been kicked out of his foster parents' home when they found cannabis in his room. And this coincided with concerns at his school about his involvement in a local gang. He moved into Annie's care home in Kent while still completing his GCSEs in London. Needless to say that his exams didn't go as he'd hoped with the commute back and forth. He decided to retake his GCSEs at a different school, which was closer but still had a commute. Unfortunately, Ben's social worker was reluctant to give Ben his train fare without physically seeing him at the college. Ben felt self-conscious about this and refused to meet the social worker. Despite Annie vouching for Ben's commitment to his studies, which was demonstrated by his coursework, Ben lost his expenses and consequently had to drop out. So what does this reveal? Firstly, I think it emphasises the hurdles facing children in some families that simply don't exist for other children. So most parents would not throw their child out of the home for taking drugs. Furthermore, most children do not have to meet social workers or other adults at their place of education to prove their commitment to their studies. Ben's story also reminds us that these children and young people want to be normal. They don't want to be singled out. However, Ben's social worker wanted to do things right rather than do the right thing. And this is a phrase that I take from the 2011 Monroe Review of Child Protection. All practitioners face pressure to do things right rather than do the right thing. I would imagine that this will resonate with any teachers or youth workers listening in, and it's certainly something that I remember from my time when I was teaching. This tension stems partly from a lack of resource. The children's social care system is chronically underfunded and understaffed, sometimes resulting in these mechanistic responses to far more complex problems. However, I think it's also about risk aversion. High-profile cases of child abuse are horrifying, and they scar local authorities, staff, and the communities that are being served deeply. Box ticking, alas, is one way in which organisations try to shield themselves from these risks. The corollary of this as well is that we can feel children are dealt with when sadly the reality is anything but. Finally, Ben's story raises questions about location placement, the location of placements. There are passionate debates about where children should be placed when placed in care, and how close they should be to their families. And contextual safeguarding, such as the threats posed in the community, such as, for example, involvement in gangs or crime, can mean that children are safer further away. Sometimes, clearly, and this was probably the case in Carl's story, it would clearly be beneficial for them to be nearer their families. My chapter looks not only at children taken fully into care, but a wider category of children called children in need. I've mentioned them briefly already. This is a wider category involving children with child in need plans, which are, I suppose, the most basic intervention, child protection plans, which are more serious, but the child stays with their family, or children who are taken into care. Importantly, and I think interestingly, children who interact with social services but are not taken into care actually experience worse outcomes than those who go into care, on average. Let's not beat about the bush. The outcomes for both sets of children are fairly woeful in terms of any metric really you care to choose, whether it's educational outcomes, well-being, or later life outcomes. Loic's mentioned this, so I won't go into detail, but my chapter does reference bright spots, including the pilot study of the deployment of social workers in schools. And I think that's a really nice illustration of how joined up thinking and multi-agency working can be beneficial. In terms of ways forward, my first suggestion, I think what I've been saying highlights the importance of what Loic described in his introduction about demarginalising schools. Schools are not our only means of addressing issues affecting young people, and the pilot that I've mentioned and that Loic's mentioned highlights this. Teachers and youth workers at this event, and anyone else working with young people, will almost certainly be working with children who've interacted with social services. In 2011, government data indicates that 1 in 10 children had been in need at some point in the last 6 years. So we're talking a high number of children. What can you do right away? Well, Rome wasn't built in a day, and nor are trusting relationships. Yet trusting relationships are fundamental for these children whose life experiences may have shaken their faith in adults. Take time to talk to the young people that you're working with and supporting. Learn about them and their interests. It often doesn't take much to show that you care. A well-timed question or even a smile can go a long way. Another suggestion is flag safeguarding concerns early. If you have any doubt, if you have a niggle, have a conversation with the safeguarding lead in your setting. Almost unanimously, the people that I interviewed about this topic said safeguarding really must be seen as everyone's concern, and I totally agree with that. Of course, this is not something that lone practitioners alone can fix. Structural changes are needed. Early help is vital. We've talked lots about that, but there was some stuff I couldn't believe. National Audit Office analysis showing how steep the reduction in early help in children's social care has been over the last decade. Local authorities have scrambled to maintain spending on care placements, but have had, as a result, to reduce the funding that they can award early help. I think that's a glaring hole. And then finally, picking up on another of Loic's themes, this of course means more funding, and I don't think we should be bashful about that. Partly this is about funding social care properly, but partly it's about helping families move out of poverty. So yeah, with that, I'll stop there, and I welcome thoughts, questions from anyone listening in. And given the number of us, I'd encourage you to take yourself off mute and just let me know what you're thinking. Hi, Penny.
My thought was from what you said about Kyle, that Annie didn't know what had happened to him once he left, because he left the home at 18, and how crucial that cut-off point of being 18 is for young people who've been in care, and that they were at 18 they get a PA instead of a social worker, so they don't get as much support as they were getting, and they're expected to manage on their own a lot more. If they're lucky, they get a staying put arrangement with their foster carer, but for a lot of them, they just have to move out into the world of semi-independent living, and you know there's a massive shortage of housing and options for those young people. So they usually get somewhere in Bristol anyway. They normally will get somewhere, but it's not clear where that will be until they're 18. And sometimes when they're told we can't find anything at the moment, when you're 18 you're going to have to go and present as homeless, and then we'll be able to put you through the system and we'll be able to find you something. But they have no certainty at 18, and that can be at any point during their educational journey. So it really disrupts things. And then once they're 19, they don't have any entitlement to funded education anyway. So is, you know, I've been in meetings lately with young people who are about to turn 18, and they're kind of climbing the walls with anxiety, and the last thing they're thinking about is finishing their next health and social care coursework piece, because they have no idea what's going to happen to them. I think people don't realise just how crucial that age is.
Absolutely, and I think a couple of things mentioned in the chapter which there simply wasn't space to there are so many of these.
I'm sure there's lots of things.
But placement stability was one, which you mentioned very briefly there. So the number of children who are moving, if you take placement stability not only to mean a care placement, but educational or you know, family stability, actually, the numbers get worrying fast in terms of how unstable children's experiences are. You mentioned, basically this cliff edge at the end of care, and that was absolutely something that struck me while I was looking at this. You mentioned staying put, and actually one of the things I haven't really, the elephant in the room in some ways is foster care. So staying put being arrangements that children can make with their foster families to essentially, you know, the clues in the name, stay put and stay part of that family after the age of 18. But of course, the corollary of that is that because some children have stayed put with foster carers, that is contributing to a shortage of foster placements. So it's all of these myriad issues that just pile on top of each other. Yeah, Noreen, did you have a question?
Well, yes. You said in both of your stories that both Carl and David had experienced love when they were growing up, and still things happened. There weren't, you know, mental health of mums and abuse at home, which led to them going into care. I know it'll need funding and all of that, but do we need to invest more at that stage where they're still at home and they haven't gone into care to provide more help and support to mothers who are loving and fathers who are loving, but because of circumstances beyond their control, you know, things spiral out and children end up in care?
There's a very simple answer to that, which is yes. Absolutely. You know, one of the really key messages is exactly that the more we can intervene early, you know, the better that will be.